Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
I remember the morning they told me they were leaving, and it felt like someone had quietly removed the floor from under me without any warning or explanation, because Mom sat at the kitchen table, smiling in that way she always does when she thinks she's saying something kind, and said, "School comes first, Emily, so you'll be fine here while we go to the resort for the week," and Dad just nodded, sipping his coffee as if his job was simply to validate whatever she said, and I nodded back. Because that's what I had been trained to do my whole life, to swallow my disappointment and smile like I was grateful for the invisible consideration that somehow excluded me. I packed a small bag, mostly out of habit, because I knew that if I protested or asked why I wasn't invited, they would give some rehearsed excuse about responsibility, about priorities, about how I was not yet mature enough to understand the finer things, and I let them have their version of the story while I sat quietly in my room, listening to the car engine hum away as they drove off, feeling that peculiar mix of relief and emptiness that comes when your absence is treated as if it doesn't matter, and that feeling stayed with me as I spent the week going through my daily routines. But now with this sharp edge of awareness that nothing in that house really belonged to me anymore, at least not in the way it had before. I noticed it first when I went into the living room to straighten a few things and realized the photo of my first solo piano recital that had always been on the mantel was gone, replaced by a small vase of flowers that had no connection to any memory at all. And when I moved toward the shelves, the trophies I had won for academic competitions were missing, not tucked away for safekeeping or rearranged temporarily, but completely absent, leaving only empty spaces that felt like hollows carved into my history, and at that moment, I understood that this wasn't an accident or a harmless oversight. This was a deliberate act of erasure. The realization hit me with a strange mix of anger and disbelief, as though the people who were supposed to be the ones protecting my past and celebrating my achievements had decided I was unworthy of any acknowledgement at all. I spent hours wandering through the rooms of that house, my hands brushing over surfaces that should have held evidence of me, and everywhere I looked, the proof of my existence had been removed, muted, and replaced with trivial ornaments that screamed their indifference louder than any words ever could. I called Sarah that evening, my voice quiet but tense, trying to explain what I was seeing, and she listened without interruption, asking questions that were sharp and practical. The kind of questions that make you feel like someone sees through the lie the world has built around you. And she said something that stuck with me long after the call ended. "They don't get to decide you don't exist, Emily. Not really. They can hide the pictures, they can pretend, but you are still you, and they're about to find out just how visible that is." Those words lingered, more potent than any anger or sadness I had felt up to that point, because they planted the seed of what I knew I needed to do, which was to take control of the narrative that my parents thought they had deleted from their minds. And I realized that if I stayed silent or passive, I would allow the people who had spent years teaching me to minimize myself to continue rewriting the story of my life without me in it, and that was something I would not allow. Over the next few days, I began taking small actions, careful not to alert them, cautious about leaving evidence that could be traced back to me, because I wanted this to be precise, intentional, and irreversible. Not a reaction born from rage, but a plan crafted with deliberate patience, the kind of plan that builds on observation, timing, and an understanding of exactly what will matter most to the people who tried to erase you, and in that process, I found a clarity I hadn't expected, a sense of power in knowing that I could exist in a way that was undeniable even if they refused to acknowledge it, that I could find a way to remind them that no amount of physical absence could remove the truth of who I was, that I could make them see me through the very lives they thought they controlled. By the end of the week, as the car pulled into the driveway and they stepped inside with suitcases in hand and wide smiles, I had already set in motion the first subtle move of my plan, something they would notice only slowly and too late to stop. A reminder that I was here, that I had always been here, and that the days of them deciding what was remembered and what was forgotten were over, though at the time, I simply stood in the kitchen doorway, nodding politely and greeting them as though nothing had changed, while inside, every fiber of me hummed with the quiet thrill of knowing that the first act of my reclamation had already begun, and the look on Dad's face when he saw the empty spaces where my things had once been was a flicker, almost imperceptible, of something unsettled, a tremor in the calm they assumed still held power over me, and in that moment, I knew that what came next would be unstoppable, because erasure is temporary, but awareness, planning, and patience are permanent, and I was no longer invisible. The day after they returned from their so-called vacation, I walked through the house with a strange sense of displacement, as though I were visiting a place I had once inhabited but no longer belonged to, and every surface, every wall, every shelf that had once carried pieces of my life had been meticulously stripped of any trace of me, leaving nothing but generic family photos, impersonal ornaments, and a silence that screamed louder than words could have. And as I stood in the living room, staring at the empty spaces where my accomplishments, my memories, and my identity had once been proudly displayed, I felt a wave of disbelief mixed with a sharp, bitter anger, because it was clear to me that this was not an accident. Not the absent-minded actions of people who had been away on a trip, but a deliberate, calculated act meant to erase me from the narrative of their lives, to make me invisible, and in that instant, I realized that the very people who were supposed to support, nurture, and celebrate me had chosen to prioritize appearances, vacations, and some abstract idea of perfection over the truth of their own child, and the magnitude of their disregard settled over me like a weight I had not expected to bear. But it was precisely that weight that began to sharpen the clarity in my mind, because I could not and would not accept being rendered invisible by the people who had once promised to protect me. I spent the afternoon scrolling through the family social media accounts, the ones they had left logged in on the tablet in the living room, and it felt as though I were stepping into an alternate reality, because there were pictures of beaches, dinners, and laughter, all tagged with my parents' names, all accompanied by captions full of enjoyment and indulgence, yet every single one conspicuously absent of me, absent even in mention, and the realization hit me with a brutal clarity that they were not merely ignoring me, they were actively pretending I did not exist, as though my presence would somehow taint their curated narrative of happiness, and the deeper I delved into the images, the more I noticed the subtle ways in which my brother, who was oblivious and blissfully unaware of the emotional cruelty, had been elevated, praised, and centered in ways that were reserved for no one else, and every post, every picture, every line of text was a reminder that my existence, my presence, my very identity had been minimized, dismissed, and removed, and yet here I was, fully alive, fully aware, and fully capable of reclaiming the space that they had tried to deny me. I called Sarah later that evening, the familiar sound of her voice grounding me even as I recounted the scope of what had happened, describing with precision the removal of photographs, the disappearance of trophies, the carefully arranged display of other people's achievements, and as I spoke, she listened without interruption, asking questions that forced me to articulate not just my anger but my plan, and by the end of the call, she had become more than a friend. She was a collaborator in what I now recognized as a necessary act of reclamation, because we both understood that the people who had tried to erase me were vulnerable to the one thing they valued above all else: perception, reputation, and the idea that everything in their carefully constructed world followed their rules, and it was through those rules, through their obsession with appearances, that I could begin to assert my presence in a way they could neither ignore nor undo. The realization that followed was almost intoxicating in its clarity, because it transformed the helplessness I had felt into strategy, turning every removed photograph into a clue about what mattered most to them, every empty shelf into a map of influence and leverage, and every subtle act of favoritism toward my brother into a tool I could use to expose their blindness and force them to confront the consequences of their indifference. And with each passing hour, the outlines of a plan began to take shape in my mind, precise, deliberate, and designed to make them see me as I truly was, as someone they could no longer dismiss, as someone who could exist outside of their control yet return to challenge their assumptions in ways that were unavoidable, undeniable, and brilliantly satisfying. By the end of the day, I had decided that silence would no longer be my companion, that passivity would no longer define me, and that the first steps toward reclaiming what they had tried to erase would be subtle, but powerful, invisible at first, growing in impact until the moment arrived when they would finally have to acknowledge not just that I existed, but that every act of disregard, every attempt to minimize me, every manipulation designed to make me feel small had only sharpened my resolve, and I knew, with a clarity that felt almost sacred in its intensity, that when the time came, they would remember me not as the child they had tried to erase, but as the force they had underestimated, the presence they had failed to control, and the brilliance they had never anticipated. By the time the second day after their return rolled around, I had spent hours mapping out every subtle vulnerability, every point where my presence or absence could make an impact without exposing my intentions, because I realized that if I acted recklessly or with obvious anger, they would only retreat into their own justifications and dismiss me once more, and I wanted this to be precise, controlled, and inescapable, something that would leave them questioning their own actions long after I was done, because it was no longer about being seen immediately, it was about constructing a series of events that forced them to reckon with the reality they had tried so hard to erase, and in doing so, I understood that patience, observation, and timing were more powerful than any sudden confrontation, and that my first move had to feel accidental, natural, and yet unavoidable in its effect, a reminder that I existed in a way they could neither ignore nor undo. I began with the small things, almost imperceptible to the casual observer but loaded with significance for someone who measured value by appearances, because I replaced a few of their carefully curated photographs in frames with images from earlier family events in which I had been the center of attention, ensuring that each picture showed me achieving something, smiling, commanding the room without arrogance, but with undeniable presence. And when Dad noticed the subtle changes later that afternoon, he froze for a brief moment, scanning the living room as if trying to convince himself that the photos were always there, and though he said nothing, I saw the twitch in his jaw and the tightening of his hands on the coffee mug. And I knew that the seed had been planted, the first acknowledgement of my existence that did not come from their generosity, but from their own inability to control the narrative, and the thrill of knowing that they had finally been forced to confront what they had dismissed was intoxicating, because it was clean, sharp, and entirely satisfying without requiring a word from me. That evening, I went further, opening the family calendar on the kitchen counter, the one they used to track birthdays, events, and obligations, and I began inputting small reminders of achievements and meetings that they had long ignored or minimized, making sure that each entry was precise, verifiable, and impossible to dismiss, because I knew they were meticulous about appearances and schedules, and every time they checked that calendar, they would see the reminders of my presence, my activity, and my accomplishments in a way that could not be erased or rationalized, and I could already imagine the subtle confusion, the whispered questions between them as they tried to rationalize why these things were there. And I smiled at the thought that I had created a system in which their own obsession with order would expose them, leaving no room for denial or excuses, and in that, I found an unexpected satisfaction that was neither cruel nor petty, but deeply strategic, a way of taking control of the environment they had tried to dominate without ever confronting them directly. I also started reaching out quietly to friends, teachers, and colleagues, sending polite messages that reminded people of my involvement in various activities, achievements, and projects that had gone unacknowledged by my parents, and each reply, each acknowledgement, each small recognition was a reinforcement of the reality that they could no longer dictate or edit the story of my life, because while they had tried to rewrite my history in their home, the world outside still remembered me, still valued me, and still treated me as a person of consequence, and the contrast between their curated indifference and the genuine acknowledgement of others became a tool I could leverage to create tension, curiosity, and subtle discomfort, knowing that when they realized the discrepancy, it would force them to see what they had tried to ignore. By the end of the third day, I had constructed a network of reminders, acknowledgments, and subtle confrontations with the reality they had attempted to erase, and as I sat in my room reviewing the small victories, I felt a sense of empowerment I had never experienced before, because this was not about retaliation in the emotional, angry sense. It was about strategic reclamation, about proving in small but undeniable ways that my existence could not be rewritten or removed, and I knew that the coming days would require more subtlety, more observation, and more precision, but for the first time, I felt as though I was moving the pieces on the board with clarity and purpose, that every action was deliberate, and that the eventual reckoning, when it came, would not just be satisfying but brilliantly inescapable, leaving them to confront the truth they had worked so hard to deny. By the time the fourth day arrived, the careful, quiet measures I had put into place began to compound in ways I had predicted, because the subtle reminders of my presence, the strategically placed photographs, the calendar entries, and the gentle outreach to friends and colleagues had created an invisible web of accountability that my parents could no longer ignore, and I watched as the tension built incrementally, first in Dad's restless pacing through the living room, the way his eyes darted to the photos he had always controlled, then in Mom's careful rearrangement of objects that had once reflected me but now carried my subtle mark, and the combination of their confusion, frustration, and growing awareness of what they had tried to erase was almost intoxicating, because it confirmed what I had understood from the beginning. They were deeply invested in a narrative that only they controlled, and when that narrative was quietly challenged, it forced them into a state of cognitive discomfort they could not easily resolve. That morning, I arranged for a small, seemingly innocent gathering with a few mutual acquaintances, people they respected and whose presence carried weight in our social circles, and I made sure that during casual conversation, achievements and moments that had previously been dismissed or ignored were mentioned, not with aggression, but with the matter-of-fact clarity of someone who had always existed at the center of her own life, and I watched their reactions closely. Noticing the way my mother's smile faltered, the subtle tightening around Dad's eyes, the half-formed excuses that never fully left their lips, and the realization that the public acknowledgement of my accomplishments outside of their curated domain created a new level of pressure, because they could no longer simply hide behind the facade of family order and parental authority when the world outside, even in small, controlled ways, recognized me, and the knowledge that I had orchestrated this exposure without confrontation gave me a sense of empowerment that had been entirely absent during the initial shock of their indifference. I escalated the plan later in the day, sending carefully worded emails to extended family members and close friends, detailing milestones, successes, and contributions that had long been ignored in the family narrative. Each message constructed to be neutral, factual, and verifiable, yet impossible for my parents to dismiss or counter without appearing negligent or cruel, and the responses began to pour in notes of congratulations, expressions of admiration, and even questions about details they had never been aware of, and I realized that by creating a network of acknowledgement beyond the confines of my home, I had forced my parents into a confrontation not with me directly, but with the undeniable truth of my existence and value. A confrontation that required reflection, explanation, and, whether they liked it or not, adjustment to their understanding of reality, and the tension in the house grew with each passing hour as they began to grapple with their own failure to recognize, honor, or even remember the presence of the child they had once claimed to cherish. By evening, I orchestrated what I called the tipping point, a scenario in which they could no longer rely on avoidance or rationalization, and I invited a family friend who had been present during many of my childhood milestones, someone whose testimony carried credibility and authority, to visit under the pretense of casual conversation, and as the discussion turned, this friend naturally referenced events, achievements, and moments that my parents had deliberately minimized or forgotten, framing them in ways that highlighted my presence, initiative, and success, and I observed their discomfort as they attempted to navigate the conversation without appearing ignorant or dismissive. Noticing the way Dad's hand shook slightly when he reached for his drink, the way Mom's voice wavered as she tried to offer vague affirmations without admitting oversight, and in that moment, I realized the brilliance of subtle strategy. By letting others speak the truth of my existence, I had created a situation in which my parents were forced to acknowledge me without me having to demand recognition directly, turning the power dynamic on its head and allowing the emotional weight of their own failures to become the instrument of reckoning. A reckoning they could neither avoid nor control. As I finally retreated to my room that night, exhausted yet exhilarated, I understood that the tipping point had been reached, that the careful layering of reminders, acknowledgements, and strategic exposures had begun to erode the carefully constructed illusion of family control, and though the confrontation had not been verbal, it had been far more powerful than any argument could have been, because it forced my parents to face the consequences of their neglect and indifference, not in theory or abstraction, but in living, undeniable reality, and I felt the first surge of satisfaction not born from revenge for its own sake, but from the knowledge that I had reclaimed my space, asserted my presence, and created a chain of events that would leave them reconsidering, reflecting, and ultimately recognizing that they had underestimated the very person they had tried to erase. And I knew, with a confidence that had grown steadily over these days, that the final act was approaching, one that would solidify the brilliance of my strategy and ensure that the last word in this story was mine. By the time I reached the 5th day, every move I had made over the past week had been deliberate, a series of small, almost imperceptible actions that built into an unshakable network of reminders, acknowledgements, and subtle confrontations with the truth they had tried so hard to erase, and I knew that this final phase had to be decisive, not through confrontation, not through anger or accusation, but through a precise orchestration that would leave them with no choice but to reckon with the reality of my existence and the consequences of their neglect, because all of the groundwork, the photographs I had replaced, the calendar entries I had edited, the emails and messages I had sent, the small gatherings where acquaintances, friends, and extended family recognized and acknowledged my presence had created a tension so thick it was impossible for them to ignore, and yet, despite the pressure mounting around them, they continued to move through the motions of denial, clinging to their fragile version of normal as if the world outside did not exist, and it was in that moment, watching them navigate their own unease, that I realized the brilliance of restraint. Letting them confront themselves without me forcing the issue was more powerful than any argument, because it allowed the consequences to unfold naturally, visibly, and with undeniable clarity. I began the morning by ensuring that the small victories I had achieved were solidified, sending carefully composed messages to several influential contacts who had interacted with my parents in professional and social settings, subtly highlighting events, successes, and contributions that I had achieved, each message crafted to be factual, verifiable, and polite, yet impossible for them to dispute, and as the replies came back, I made sure they reached my parents indirectly, through shared groups, forwarded emails, and social media interactions that could not be deleted or ignored, because I understood that their discomfort needed to build to a crescendo where they could no longer escape recognition without publicly acknowledging their own oversight, and as I observed them checking devices, scanning for updates, and attempting to maintain composure while processing the increasing frequency of reminders of my presence, I felt a growing sense of satisfaction that was neither malicious nor petty, but deeply strategic, a confirmation that the system I had constructed was working exactly as intended, leaving them exposed, accountable, and increasingly anxious without me ever raising my voice or demanding their attention. By mid-afternoon, I executed the most important component of my plan, arranging a private conversation with my mother under the guise of a casual discussion about family matters, and I subtly guided the conversation toward memories, achievements, and decisions that had long been minimized or forgotten, carefully observing the micro-expressions, hesitations, and half-formed defenses that revealed their internal struggle to reconcile the narrative they had created with the undeniable truth I presented, and as I shared information that was factual, documented, and corroborated by others, I watched her internal balance shift, seeing the moment when the weight of unacknowledged reality began to topple the carefully constructed walls of denial she had maintained, while all the time remaining calm, composed, and precise. because any hint of confrontation or overt aggression would have allowed them to retreat into excuses and rationalizations, but by presenting the evidence subtly, persistently, and with undeniable clarity, I ensured that the acknowledgement of my existence came not as a concession, but as an unavoidable truth that could no longer be ignored. Later in the day, I orchestrated the final public confirmation, arranging a brief family gathering where key people I had contacted over the past week were present, not for a dramatic reveal, but as a natural interaction in which my presence, achievements, and involvement were openly recognized and discussed, and I watched as my parents navigated the impossible tension of being confronted with both public and private acknowledgement of the very child they had attempted to erase, and with every passing minute, their discomfort deepened, their attempts to redirect or dismiss failed, and I could see the realization settle in. The denial, the control, and the indifference they had relied on were no longer viable because the world outside, the people who mattered, and the documentation I had carefully assembled had all conspired to make my presence inescapable, undeniable, and respected, leaving them to reckon with not only my existence, but the consequences of the emotional distance, neglect, and erasure they had imposed for so long. By the time the evening came, I allowed myself to step back, observing the subtle, silent acknowledgement in their behavior, the slight shifts in posture, the measured words, and the unspoken admission that they could no longer ignore me. And as I reflected on the week's events, I understood that the brilliance of this plan was in its subtlety and precision. No confrontation, no anger, no dramatics, only the meticulous reclaiming of space, recognition, and truth that they had tried so hard to erase, and in that quiet, undeniable victory, I felt an overwhelming sense of triumph that was strategic, emotionally satisfying, and utterly irreversible, leaving them to confront their own failures and me to exist fully in the life they had once attempted to rewrite.